Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be telling you about all the books I read in the month of September. So I read 10 books in September and I read some really good things. Usually I start these videos off with a little goals check-in. So in terms of my goal to finish reading the works of Anthony Trollope, I did read a book by Anthony Trollope this month. It was one I had read before. It was a reread, but I hadn't read it since I was like 14, 15. So I did want to reread it and I'm glad that I did. Another goal for this year was to read the 19 books that have been at my TBR for the longest, and I read 4 of them this month, so pretty pleased with that. And then another goal I had for 2025 was to read more internationally and read more in translation, which I did not do this month. This month was a very British dominated book. I think I read 1 book from the US and everything else I read was from the UK. But that is okay. You know, I think this partly comes with the territory of trying to get through my long-term physical TBR, which is more heavily dominated by British literature. And I also feel like I'm not very good at focusing my mind on multiple goals at once. So in August, I read a lot of international literature and no books from my long-term physical TBR. And in September, I have flipped it, and that's fine. Right, things that I read in September. So I will start off with my Anthony Trollope book, and that was Rachel Ray. So this, as I said, is one that I've read before, but not for a really long time. I had forgotten most of it, and it was really nice to revisit it. This is a relatively short Anthony Trollope novel following a sort of love story with obstacles, I suppose. There's a young woman called Rachel Ray who lives in a cottage with her mother and sister. They are sort of in the lower middle classes, I suppose. They don't have that much money, and they're not sort of like highly respected in the town, but they are like in the middle classes. Rachel meets a young man called Luke Rowan, who has come to town because he has just inherited a important share in a local brewery. Luke and Rachel meet and like each other, but various things kind of get in the way of their relationship. And one of the things that sort of gets between them is sort of like issues of respectability and trustworthiness, because Rachel's elder sister basically doesn't think that any young woman talking to any young man could possibly be respectable and is very suspicious of Luke, and everything kind of goes on from there. And there's lots of drama around the brewery and a local election and various other things. I really enjoyed Rachel Ray. It was good fun, really interesting, not a top tier Trollope. I feel like I remembered it very fondly because it was the 3rd Anthony Trollope book I read, and I was like, oh yes, I love Anthony Trollope. But returning to it after I've read like 42 of his books, it wouldn't be that high in my ranking. It's good, it's fine, I enjoyed it a lot, but there are more exciting books by Anthony Trollope out there. That's what I'd say. Also worth knowing, if you do read Rachel Ray, in the sort of like final quarter of the book, there's quite a lot of like anti-Semitism. The local election is contested between like the local squire and a Jewish tailor, and a lot of the characters are very anti-Semitic towards the tailor. It's one of those Victorian books where like there's lots of anti-Semitism on the page, and it's mostly in dialogue and like characters' thoughts, and it's like a little bit criticised by Anthony Trollope's authorial voice, but like not very much. So I think that is worth being aware of if you're going into the book. But anyway, I'm glad that I finally reread Rachel Ray. And then the other Victorian book I read in September was another reread, and that was Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, which I just love. I love it so much. Oh, it's such a great book, and it was so lovely to reread it. I have read it a few times before. I think this was probably my 3rd or 4th reading, but oh, I just love it so much. It's so good. It's such a good book. I'm really having such a great time with Jen the Librarian's Thomas Hardy read-along, reading all of his books in publication order. And it's interesting reading them in publication order because the previous book, A Pair of Blue Eyes, I really like, but like, I feel like Far from the Madding Crowd is such a step up. And I just think it's one of his best, and I just love it so much. It is the story of a woman called Bathsheba Everdeen who takes over her uncle's farm, decides to run it herself, although she's a woman, so quite unusual position for the Victorian period. And it's about her relationship with 3 men, 3 possible suitors, who are all very, very different. And I just love Gabriel Oak with all my heart, and I think he's wonderful. I just love Far from the Madding Crowd so much. Just like every minute of listening to the audiobook was just pure joy. Even the really distressing bits, you know, I was just loving it. I think it's so fantastic. I think the characterization is so great. The emotions are so good. I love all the details about farming. I love the look at the position of women within the Victorian period. I love the characterization, which I think is so complex and so rich. Like even the characters who I dislike, I think are drawn so well. And I just think it's incredible. And you should all go read Far from the Madding Crowd, one of my favorite Victorian books. This reread reread just reminded me how much I love it. So maybe it is my favourite Thomas Hardy. I'm often divided between Far From the Madding Crowd and Jude the Obscure and The Woodlanders, but we will see when I reread them all in order, which I'm doing now. I'm on to The Hand of Ethelberta. It's great. I love Thomas Hardy. Then sticking with the 19th century, but crossing the pond, I also read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, meaning to read this for a very, very long time, and I finally got round to it, and I didn't like it that much. And I feel quite bad because I feel like it's a book that a lot of people love and that I've been meaning to read for such a long time, that therefore maybe I built it up a bit too much in my head, and I just didn't get on with it that well. I do think I was also possibly in a bit of a reading slump at the beginning of the month. The 2 books I read at the beginning of September, I didn't get into really. I finished them, but I don't really feel like I was fully invested. And I don't know whether that was me or the book, if you see what I mean. But anyway, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a story of a young boy called Huckleberry Finn who runs away from his violent father and ends up travelling with a runaway slave called Jim, and they travel down the Mississippi on a raft. The book was published in the 1880s, but it's set in the 1830s, so before slavery was abolished in the South. And we are following the adventures of Huckleberry and Jim. The book is very episodic, which for some reason I wasn't really expecting, and meant I struggled to get into it. I was expecting more of an overarching plot, and it doesn't really have that. It's one of those books, I suppose, where I didn't really feel engaged with the story, but I did find it a really interesting historical look at the 19th century US, and I feel like I was very interested in what the book had to say and the time it was written, and I found it really interesting on a historical level, but I didn't love it as a novel, I suppose. However, I am really glad I read it because, as I said, I did find it very historically interesting. And I have James by Percival Everett on my TBR, which is a retelling of this, which I'm very excited to read. So I'm looking forward to that. I feel like I will like it more than Huckleberry Finn. Then I read a couple of Agatha Christie books in September. My husband Nick and I are working our way through the Poirot series in order, listening to them on audiobook, mostly the audiobooks narrated by Hugh Fraser, who's great. And we really enjoy listening to Agatha Christie together, though these two were not necessarily the most successful. So we listened to The Labours of Hercules, which is a short story collection where Hercule Poirot decides he's going to take on 12 cases that mirror the labours of Hercules, and then we watch him take on those cases. Some of the short stories are really, really fun. I really loved the first one, but some of the short stories are a little bit nothingy. I enjoyed it, it's good fun, but probably one for the Poirot completionists rather than a Poirot must read. And then the next one we read, the next novel in the Poirot series is Taken at the Flood, which I had some problems with. So I love Agatha Christie, I do. I love the way she writes. I love her dialogue. I find her books fascinating. But there were some things I didn't love so much about Taken at the Flood. It's set just after the Second World War, and it follows the tensions in a family where lots of relatives had kind of grown up to rely financially on one particular relative of theirs. But not long ago, he married a young widow and then died in the London Blitz without making a will. So now this young widow of his has inherited the family fortunes, and all the family who were kind of waiting for their legacies and expecting their legacies aren't happy about it. And then there is a murder. Everything goes on from there. There was a lot I really liked about Taken at the Flood. I feel like it had a lot of really interesting characters, and I especially found it really historically interesting because it's set just after the Second World War, and this sense of dissatisfaction with everything after the Second World War was really interesting to read about. And was, just fascinating. However, I feel like it's one of her least satisfying mysteries. I didn't find the solution as satisfying as I usually do. And then the very end, the end to the subplot rather than the end to the mystery plot, I thought was really bad, and I was not impressed. So I love Agatha Christie a lot. I will, of course, keep reading her books, but Taken at the Flood is, another one for the Poirot completionists rather than a must-read Poirot. Not my favourite. Anyway, I feel like I'm being more negative than usual today, so let's move on. I also read Green Witch by Susan Cooper, which is a children's classic from the 1970s. This is the third book in a series, The Dark is Rising series, which I have been reading for the last year or so, and I'm really, really enjoying. They're really good fun. They have a lot of interesting British folklore magic elements to them, which I really enjoy. And in this third book in the series, the main characters from the first book and second book kind of team up, because those first two books were quite separate, and that's really fun as well. I don't want to say too much more than that because it is the third book in a series, but I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading on with the series later in the year. And then I also read The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, which is a long book that took up a lot of my September. Now, I had started reading this in August, but I wasn't that far through by the end of August, so I read the bulk of this in September, and I thought it was really, really great. This is a book I've been meaning to read for a while. It's a big, long, epic historical novel from the 1980s, I think, and it's set in 12th century England and follows various characters who are drawn together by the building of a cathedral. So we're following one character who is the prior of the cathedral, who is kind of responsible for overseeing the building of it. We're also following a stonemason and his stepson, who also wants to become a builder and a mason. Then we're also following a young woman who is the daughter of an earl, and her story, and then a highborn young man who is just one of the most evil characters I've ever encountered. And we follow all of these people over several decades, all around the building of a cathedral. And it's a big epic book, but I really think it is worth your time. And I overall loved it. I feel like there were points in this book where I was like, this is a 5-star new favourite, and there were other points where I was like, maybe a 4.5 star. I feel like the very end went on a little bit too long, and there's also a lot of very graphic violence, including some very graphic scenes of sexual assault in this book. And I think they are there for a reason, and they're there to explore the brutality of the society that this book is depicting, but I think they do go on too long, and there are sections of this book that are exceptionally hard to read. There are some moments in this book that are really, really tough to get through, and there is one of the main characters especially, who I mentioned, who is such a horrible person that the sections in his perspective are a really tough read, for a reason, but again, makes it a bit harder to get through. So overall, I would really, really heartily recommend this, but I think it is worth knowing those things going in. I do think it's a fantastic book, and I feel like it's one of those books that will stay with me a long time, partly because it's so long and it's so rich. The characterization is absolutely fantastic. Like, even that horrible character whose head I didn't want to be in was so impeccably drawn and so believably drawn. The themes are fascinating. The writing was really rich, but also really accessible and smooth. Like, it's a long book, but it never felt... Well, it felt like a difficult read for the content, but never the writing. And I really, really got a lot out of this. So I'm very glad that I read it. And I read this with my historical fiction book club that I run over on my Patreon, and it was nice to read it with other people because it is quite a long book. But yeah, I'm very glad that we read it. 3 more books to go, all from my long-term physical TBR, as indeed was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So one thing I read is The Hollow Sea by Annie Kirby, which is a contemporary reading group novel, I guess, about a woman who is struggling with infertility and decides to visit this island that she thinks may have some connection to her own birth. She was adopted at a relatively late age, like when she was 7 or 8, and she doesn't really remember anything about her childhood before that point, but there is this island that she's seen a picture of and she recognises, and she wants to know why, so she goes back to this island and everything kind of goes on from there. This was the book I read before The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, when I feel like I was in a little bit of a reading slump, so I feel like I wasn't like as invested in the book as I should have been, but I just wasn't quite like in the right headspace. So I'm not sure I completely gelled with it, but it was a really interesting book, and there were some really moving passages, especially towards the end. And then I read 2 works of historical fiction. So one was The Seal Woman's Gift by Sally Magnuson. Really enjoyed this. I'm really glad to have finally read it, one I've been meaning to get to for a while, and I've read one book by her before, Music in the Dark, which I really loved. I think on balance I probably do prefer Music in the Dark, but I really enjoyed The Seal Woman's Gift, which is set in 17th century Iceland, and looks at a real historical event when 40 people were abducted by pirates from Icelandic islands and sold into slavery in Algeria. And we're following a woman called Auster and her life and what happens to her as she lives this very unusual life, and goes to a place that she never would have imagined that she would go. What I really loved about this book is that it has a lot of really, really complex themes, explored in really complicated ways, but the writing style is just very, very smooth and easy to read. I read this after Huckleberry Finn when I felt like I had been in a little bit of a reading slump, and then I opened this book and read like the first 2 lines and I was like, I love this writing style. This is the kind of writing style I love. And I just like really got into it and felt really immersed immediately. So that was very nice. And I found this book hugely moving. I think there were some incredibly powerful moments in it. Some really, really interesting characters, some really interesting themes. It's a really interesting work of historical fiction looking at a really interesting historical event. So I would really highly recommend this. Very interesting novel, really worth your time. And then I also read This Wild Wild Country by Inga Vesper. This is a proof copy, so I'll put the final cover up here as well. This book did come out several years ago, and I actually read a little bit of it many years ago because I used to work at the publisher, and I worked on Inga Vesper's first book, The Long Long Afternoon, which is fantastic and you should absolutely read as well. So it's really nice to finally read this in full because I love Inga's writing. I think she just writes fantastically. And This Wild Wild Country is a work of historical fiction set partly in the 1970s and partly in the 1930s. And in 1970, we are following two women, one of whom is a young woman who is involved in the hippie movement, and one is a woman who is married to an abusive husband, and before her marriage she wanted to be a police officer, but she gave up that career to get married, and now she has run away, and she arrives in this new town to find that there has been a murder. One of the hippies in the local hippie commune that Glitter, the other main character, is part of, has been killed, and Joanna decides that she is going to return to her old work and investigate, and everything kind of goes on from there. So it's a historical murder mystery in some ways, but there is so much else going on in this book. I love this novel. I sped through it and enjoyed it so much. The characterization is so rich. The themes are fascinating. The look at this really interesting point in time where things are changing, but how much are they changing? Like, all of that stuff is just great. So I really recommend This Wild Wild Country. I thought it was fantastic. So there we go. Those are the books that I read in September. I did also read a chunk more of Varney the Vampire, which is a Victorian penny dreadful. I've been reading for ages, but I didn't quite manage to finish it, so before the end of the year, I hope. And I also read quite a lot of short stories from the Persephone book of short stories, which is another book that has been in my TBR for a very long time. But again, I didn't finish it, so I will talk about that whenever I do finish it, hopefully by the end of the year. Okay, that is all for now. Thank you so much for watching. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. Otherwise, that's all for now, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.